15 guards had already failed to control Lorenzo Valenti's black stallion when Cassandra Mercer, 8 months pregnant and barely 5'1", stepped into the paddock with nothing but a sugar cube in her trembling hand. Blood still streaked the dirt where the third man had fallen. Someone was screaming for tranquilizers. Another guard clutched his dislocated shoulder, face twisted in agony. The Mafia boss himself stood frozen on the terrace above, watching the symbol of his empire's power, 1,000 pounds of pure black fury, rear up again. Hooves sliced through the morning air like blades. The horse screamed. Not a whinny, not a snort. A sound that belonged to something wounded beyond all reason. Before Cassie takes another step toward that 1,000-pound beast, hit that like button and subscribe. Because what happens next? It changes everything. The Valenti estate sprawled across 70 acres of Napa Valley hills, a place where money could buy absolute silence and secrets never crossed beyond the iron gates. This was Lorenzo Valenti's kingdom, where every stone, every vine, every shadow cast by an oak belonged to him, and the black horse in the paddock, Shadow, was a symbol of power he put on display for the entire underworld to see. The purebred Frisian, worth $2 million, had been fighting for a full 20 minutes without stopping. A rope still hung loose around its neck, where red welts had bitten deep into flesh from repeated, violent yanks. Long scratches scored its shoulder, and its glossy black coat was clumped and slick with sweat and dirt. It wasn't attacking. It was defending itself. Cassie stood at the fence, far from the chaos, about 40 feet away. She'd been carrying a laundry basket toward the west side of the mansion when the horse's screams stopped her in her tracks. 3 weeks working here, and she'd learned the first rule. Don't look, don't ask, don't get involved. But her legs wouldn't obey. She laid a hand over her swollen belly, feeling the baby kick softly inside, as if it, too, was uneasy. 8 months. Just a few weeks left. She shouldn't be here. She should turn away, finish her work, take the money, and disappear before anyone noticed she existed. But she couldn't take her eyes off the horse. 15 guards surrounded Shadow, tightening into a ring. They moved with a predator's coordination, shoulders taut, hands ready, eyes locked on their quarry. Each time one man stepped forward, Shadow backed away, eyes rolling white, ears pinned flat to its head. Each time they tried to close in, it spun in a frantic circle, hooves tearing up the earth, breath blasting like a bellows. Cassie saw what none of them saw. The horse wasn't vicious. It was terrified. Terrified to the point of losing control. Terrified to the point of being willing to fight to the death because it had no other choice. She knew that look. She'd seen it in the mirror for 27 years of her life. Derek Kane, the estate's head of security, noticed her first. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face as if carved from granite. He strode toward her, voice razor cold. "Ma'am, leave now." Cassie didn't move. She kept watching the horse, watching the way it trembled every time someone drew near, watching the way it threw its head back as if trying to wrench free from some invisible pain. A younger guard, blood still running from a cut on his forehead, turned and stared at her with anger. "That monster nearly killed 3 of us. You want to be the 4th victim," Cassie finally spoke, her voice strangely steady amid the violence around her. "It's scared." The young guard blinked. "What?" "It's scared," Cassie repeated, her gaze never leaving Shadow. "It's not dangerous. It's scared. The more you surround it, the more scared it gets. The more you shout, the more it panics. You're driving an animal into a corner and acting surprised when it fights back." A brief silence. The young guard looked at her as if she'd started speaking a foreign language. Derek Kane stepped closer, his voice lower now but still thick with threat. "Who are you?" "Cassandra Mercer, housekeeper." "Downstairs, then go back downstairs." Cassie didn't answer. Her hand slipped into the pocket of her apron, where she'd kept a small thing since morning, a sugar cube. She'd planned to save it for afternoon tea, a rare bit of sweetness in the long work days. The cube had half melted from her body heat, soft and sticky against her fingertips. Now it became something else. A bridge, an offer, a test. Cassie closed her fingers around it, feeling it dissolve further in her palm. She looked at Shadow, now standing in the middle of the paddock, ribs heaving, eyes still wild but with something else threaded through them now. Exhaustion. It couldn't fight forever. Derek took another step toward her, his voice colder. "I won't ask again." Cassie looked past him, as if he didn't exist. She looked at the horse, then she looked at the paddock gate, only a few steps away. She knew what she was about to do was insane. She was 8 months pregnant, Small, fragile, with nothing but a sugar cube in her hand. The horse weighed nearly 500 kilos and had already taken down 3 grown men. But Cassie knew something else too. She knew fear. She knew what it felt like to be shoved into a corner with no one offering a hand. She knew what it was to fight because there was no other choice. And she knew that sometimes the only thing that could break fear wasn't strength. It was gentleness. Cassie walked toward the gate. Her hand settled on the ice-cold iron bar. She pushed it open, and she stepped inside. The iron gate screeched shut behind Cassie. The sound felt like a declaration, a line drawn between safety and the point of no return. Instantly, shouts erupted from every direction. "Stop. Someone block her. Are you out of your mind?" Derek Kane sprinted for the gate, one hand reaching out to yank her back. But it was too late. Cassie was already inside the paddock, separated from him by an iron fence and an entirely different world. He stood there with his fist clenched around the metal bar, staring at her as if she'd just signed her own death warrant. Dust hung in the air like a held breath. The whole paddock seemed to freeze for an endless moment, time slowing down so much Cassie could feel each tiny speck of dust turning in the light. The California morning sun was harsher than ever, pouring onto her shoulders like a heavy garment, so hot she felt sweat bead on her forehead within seconds. Her heart slammed against her ribs, beat after beat thundering in her ears like war drums. The baby kicked hard, harder than ever before, as if protesting this decision, as if screaming, "Mom, don't do this. Mom, come back." But Cassie didn't turn around. She'd made this choice 3 weeks ago, when she'd walked into the Valenti estate with a torn bag and not a cent to her name. She'd chosen to survive. She'd chosen to keep moving even when the road ahead was pitch black. She'd chosen not to stop, not to collapse, not to surrender. And today, in this paddock, she was making the same kind of choice again. Keep going, even afraid, even shaking, even while everything inside her screamed to run. Shadow lifted its head the moment it sensed a new presence in its territory. Those black eyes locked onto Cassie, wild, pained, and razor alert. The horse stood there like a black statue against the brown-gray earth, every muscle rigid, ready for the next threat. It had fought 15 men. It had been choked by rope, shouted at, surrounded. And now, a small woman stepped into its circle of hell. Cassie stopped. She stood about 15 feet from the horse, close enough to see each bead of sweat darkening its black coat, far enough not to be an immediate threat. She didn't move closer. She didn't back away. She didn't demand anything, didn't command anything, didn't do a single thing those 15 guards had done. She simply stood there and waited. Behind the fence, Derek Kane shouted, his voice cracking with fear and anger. "Get out of there now. Get out before it kills you." Cassie heard him. She heard every shout, every warning, every chaotic sound around her. But she didn't turn her head. She didn't take her eyes off Shadow. Instead, she opened her mouth and spoke. Her voice was small, soft, only loud enough for the horse to hear. "It's okay." Each word left her lips like a whisper, like a lullaby from some faraway memory. "You don't have to fight anymore." Shadow didn't move, but something shifted in its eyes, just a flicker, so small no one else could have noticed, but Cassie did. She saw it because she was looking for it, a spark of something that wasn't fear. Maybe curiosity, maybe confusion, maybe a silent question. "Who are you, that you're not like the others?" Cassie stayed still, like a tree sunk deep into the ground. She didn't rush. She didn't crowd it. She'd learned this lesson when she was little, from a man who once sat in the dirt for 6 hours just to earn the trust of a horse that had been beaten. Patience wasn't weakness. Patience was wisdom. Shadow exhaled in a long, forceful breath, so strong Cassie could see dust lift from the ground. Its ears tipped forward toward her, then flattened, then lifted again. Its glossy black head tilted slightly, as if it was trying to understand something it had never encountered before. The battle inside the horse showed in every muscle. Tendons tightened, then eased. One foreleg stepped forward a small distance, then stopped. Its eyes never left Cassie, but the wildness softened by the smallest degree, just a little, like the sun slipping out from behind a storm cloud. Between trust and fear, the horse stood on the thinnest edge, and Cassie knew that one wrong move, one loud sound, one hurried step, and everything would shatter. So she did nothing at all. She just stood there, her hand still closed around the sugar cube in her palm, and she waited for the horse to make its own decision. Cassie slowly raised her hand. Slow, so slow. slow enough that she could feel every inch of air her arm moved through. The sugar cube sat in her palm, small, ivory white, partly melted and slightly sticky against her skin. It looked fragile there, resting on a hand roughened by work, a tiny piece of sweetness she'd meant to save for herself. Now it was everything she had to offer. She extended her arm forward, palm up, opened wide like an invitation without words. No threat, no demand, just the simplest offer one living creature could give another. 1 breath, 2 breaths, 3 breaths. The paddock fell into silence as if the whole world was holding its breath. No one dared move. No one dared speak. 15 guards stood frozen outside the fence, eyes fixed on what was happening, unable to believe what they were seeing. Even the wind seemed to stop, leaving behind a stillness so tight it felt like it could choke you. Shadow stood there, its body still rigid, its eyes still locked on Cassie. But something was different. The horse no longer looked at her the way it looked at an enemy. It was looking at her like something it had never encountered, an unsolved equation, a question it didn't know how to answer. Then it took 1 step toward her, just one, careful, wary. Its hoof touched the ground so lightly it almost made no sound at all. Cassie didn't flinch. She stood like a statue, arm still outstretched, palm still open, the sugar cube still resting there. She didn't speak. She didn't do anything. She simply waited, patient as earth waiting for rain, as night waiting for dawn. The horse snorted hard, a burst of hot breath blowing from its nostrils, its head tossing up. Behind the fence, the guards tensed, a few hands drifting toward holsters on instinct. But no one moved. No one dared break this fragile moment. Shadow took another step, then another. The distance between it and Cassie shrank, from 15 feet to 10, then 8, then 6. Cassie's arm began to ache. She'd held it up too long, muscles trembling under the weight of itself. The sugar cube warmed against her skin, melting a little more, sticking more firmly to her palm. Sweat beaded on her forehead even though the California morning wasn't hot. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, steady but fast, like a drum keeping time for some sacred rite. The baby inside her went quiet, as if it, too, was holding its breath with the rest of the world. Shadow moved closer still, close enough that Cassie could see every detail of its face, the deep black eyes with pupils blown wide, the nostrils flaring as it drew in her scent, and the cuts along its neck, where the rope had rubbed raw flesh through 20 minutes of struggle. Bright red and viciously painful looking, Cassie wanted to cry when she saw those wounds. But she didn't cry. She only stood still, palm still open, the sugar cube still there, waiting. The horse's muzzle touched her palm, warm, damp, trembling. Cassie felt its breath against her skin, felt the soft hair around its nose brush her fingers. A moment of contact. A bridge laid across the chasm between fear and trust. Shadow sniffed the sugar. Then, slowly, it opened its mouth and took that small gift from her hand. Cassie felt the horse's lips against her palm, unexpectedly soft and warm. The horse chewed, a faint, crackling sound in the still air. She waited until it swallowed. Then, slow as if she were moving underwater, she lifted her hand and touched its neck. The horse's skin was hot beneath her palm, soaked with sweat, trembling lightly. She stroked gently, fingers sliding over the sleek black coat, steering clear of the wounds, offering only the chastest kind of gentleness. Shadow let out a long sigh. A deep, heavy breath poured from its massive body, as if it had just released the past 20 minutes of hell. Its large head lowered, lower, lower, until it was nearly level with the ground. For the first time in 20 minutes, the horse stood still, completely still. Silence settled over the paddock like an invisible blanket. 15 guards stood like stone figures, mouths open, eyes wide, unable to believe what they'd just witnessed. The horse that had taken down 3 grown men was now standing quietly beside a small, pregnant woman, head bowed low as if asking to be sheltered. On the mansion balcony, Lorenzo Valenti stood motionless. His hand dropped from the railing he'd been gripping so hard until now. His eyes never left the small woman below, the one standing in the paddock with her hand on the neck of the wildest horse he'd ever owned. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know where she'd come from, but he knew one thing. He'd just watched the impossible happen right in front of him. Lorenzo Valenti came down from the balcony. Each of his steps rang on the stone as if fate itself were knocking, unhurried yet absolute. He crossed the perfectly trimmed lawn, past the flower beds the gardeners tended every day, and walked straight toward the paddock. People moved aside without thinking as he approached. No one dared block his path. No one dared meet his eyes. This was his domain, and every step he took reminded everyone of that. The guards stood taller, stiffer, like soldiers before their general. Derek Kane shifted aside and dipped his head slightly as his boss passed. Lorenzo stopped at the paddock gate. He looked inside, at the black horse standing quietly beside the small woman, and something strange flickered through his eyes. Not anger, not irritation, curiosity, a feeling he hadn't felt in a very long time. He opened the gate and stepped in. The guards tensed at once, a few moving forward on instinct, but Lorenzo lifted a hand to stop them. He didn't need anyone to protect him. He never had. Shadow lifted its head when it sensed someone new entering its territory. Dark eyes studied Lorenzo, measuring, wary. But the horse didn't rear. It didn't scream. It didn't attack. It only watched him for a moment, then turned back to Cassie, as if deciding the man wasn't worth its attention. Lorenzo felt something odd tighten in his chest. His horse, the horse he'd paid $2 million to buy, the horse that was the symbol of the Valenti Empire's power, had just dismissed him to return to a housekeeper. He stopped a few feet from them and simply observed. For the first time, he truly looked at the woman. She was small, not even 5'1", so thin her shoulder bones pressed sharply beneath a plain shirt. Her belly was large, rounded tight with a baby about to be born, a strange contrast against the rest of her fragile frame. Her hair was chestnut brown, at first pinned up neatly but now loosened, messy strands spilling over her shoulders and down her back. But what Lorenzo couldn't look away from was her eyes, calm in a way that didn't make sense. There was no fear in them, no worry, none of the shrinking deference he was used to seeing in people when they stood before him. She looked at the horse with gentleness, her hand still stroking its neck as if standing in a paddock with a wild beast was the most ordinary thing in the world. Lorenzo spoke, his voice low and heavy with authority. "Who are you?" Cassie didn't turn around. She kept stroking Shadow's neck, her voice even, as if she were talking about the weather. "Cassandra Mercer, housekeeper, downstairs, housekeeper, downstairs." He had dozens of servants in this mansion, and he couldn't remember the face of a single one. They were ghosts moving through his house, cleaning, cooking, washing, then disappearing. But this woman was different. She didn't disappear. She stepped into the center of chaos and did what no one else could do. "How did you know how to do that?" Lorenzo asked, his eyes still on her. This time Cassie turned. She looked him straight in the eye. No bowed head, no avoidance, not a trace of fear or submission. That look surprised Lorenzo. Very few people dared look at him that way. And among the ones who did, most of them were dead. "I grew up with horses," she said, her voice still calm. "They don't respond to strength. They respond to safety, or the promise of it." Lorenzo said nothing. He watched her for a few more seconds, as if trying to read something hidden beneath that composed surface. A pregnant housekeeper, small and frail, with nothing but a sugar cube, had just tamed the horse his 15 trained guards couldn't control. And she was talking about safety, about a promise, as if those were things he didn't understand. Maybe he truly didn't. Then he turned away and walked out of the paddock without another word. The guards parted as he passed, and he stopped beside Derek Kane. His voice dropped, only loud enough for one man to hear. "Find out everything about her." "Everything." Derek nodded, not asking questions. He knew when to stay quiet and obey. Lorenzo walked on toward the mansion, but before he went inside, he looked back once more. In the paddock, Cassie was still standing beside Shadow. She'd turned back to stroke the horse's neck again, completely focused on it, as if the conversation a moment ago had never happened, as if the most powerful Mafia boss in Napa Valley had never appeared at all. And somehow, in a way Lorenzo couldn't explain, that made it impossible for him to stop thinking about her. That night, Cassie returned to the small room in the staff quarters on the lower floor of the mansion. The room was only big enough for a single bed, an old wooden wardrobe, and a small window that faced the back of the house. Nothing here belonged to her, except the torn bag tucked into the corner of the closet. She sat on the edge of the bed and felt the worn springs sink under her weight. Her hand settled on her belly, rubbing in slow circles, and the baby inside shifted in reply like a greeting. She smiled, the first smile of the day, meant only for the small, living soul no one but her knew was there. Memory came in like the tide, uninvited and unstoppable. Montana, 19 years ago. She was 8, hair braided into 2 plaits, feet swallowed by her mother's oversized rubber boots. Her father, Thomas Mercer, the best horse whisperer in the whole county, held her hand and led her to a ranch on the edge of town. "There was a horse there," the ranch owner said. "A horse beaten so badly no one dared go within 10 feet of it. It bit. It kicked. It had broken a man's arm. The owner wanted to shoot it because there was no other way." Her father didn't say a word. He only took a bucket, filled it with oats, and walked into the paddock. He sat down in the dirt, set the bucket in front of him, and waited. The horse stood in the farthest corner, eyes rolled white, body trembling, ready to strike anyone who came close. But her father didn't come close. He just sat there. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. Cassie perched on the fence, legs swinging, watching her father sit motionless under the sun, then under shade, then under the sun again. 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours passed. He didn't speak, didn't move, didn't do anything except sit there with that bucket of oats. Then the horse stepped forward, 1 step at a time, slow, cautious, until it stood in front of her father and lowered its head to eat. On the way home that day, her father held her hand and spoke, his voice deep and warm as late afternoon light. "Patience isn't weakness, sweetheart. It's wisdom." Cassie remembered that lesson. She carved it into bone and flesh, kept it like treasure through the years that followed. But she also remembered what came after. Her mother died when Cassie was 8, a few months after that day on the ranch. She fell ill and was gone in a bitter winter night, leaving Cassie and her father with an empty house and a grief no words could hold. Her father changed after her mother died. He still worked, still gentled horses, still taught Cassie lessons about patience. But the light in his eyes went out. He drank more. He spoke less. He stared into nothing more often. Then one morning, when Cassie was 16, she woke up to find the house hollow. Her father had left in the night. No note, no explanation, not a single word. He couldn't bear it anymore. Life was too hard, the pain too large, and he chose to run. She took care of herself after that. 16 years old, alone, no father, no mother, no money, no future. She did whatever work she could find, washing dishes in diners, cleaning rooms in cheap motels. She learned how to become invisible, how to move through life without leaving a mark, how to survive when no one cared whether she lived or died. Then, 2 years ago, she met him, a man with a warm smile and sweet promises. She thought it was love, thought she'd finally found someone who cared, thought life might be less lonely. She was wrong. When she told him she was pregnant, that smile disappeared. He looked at her like a problem that needed solving, and then he said the words she would never forget. "I'm not ready to be a father." He vanished right after that. No phone number, no address, no trace. She was alone again, but this time it wasn't only her. There was a small living soul growing inside her, completely dependent on her, completely trusting she would protect it. 3 weeks ago, when the money was gone and there was nowhere left to go, she found that agency. They didn't ask for papers, didn't ask about her past, didn't wonder why a pregnant woman needed work so urgently. They paid in cash and placed her in a mansion in Napa Valley. She took the job without knowing who the owner was, without knowing what kind of world she was stepping into. She only needed a roof, work, a chance to survive until the baby was born. Cassie blinked and returned to the present. The small room was still dark, lit only by moonlight slipping through the window. She looked outside, toward the distant stables in the night. Shadow was out there, maybe sleeping, maybe still awake. She wondered if the horse was thinking about her the way she was thinking about it. In her mind, she whispered to herself, the words rising like a prayer. Just one safe place. For my baby, but something had changed today. 3 weeks here, and she'd learned how to be invisible. Walk softly, speak softly, lower her head, avoid eyes, finish the work, and disappear as if she'd never existed. That was how she survived. That was how she protected herself and the child inside her. But today, when she walked into that paddock, when she stood before a wild horse, when she looked straight into the eyes of the most powerful Mafia boss in Napa Valley, she broke every rule. Today, she'd been seen. 3 days had passed since what happened in the paddock. 3 days in which Lorenzo Valenti couldn't stop thinking about the small woman with the sugar cube in her hand. He sat in the office on the mansion's 2nd floor, where oak-paneled walls and leather-bound shelves created a kind of power you could feel the moment you stepped inside. Derek Kane stood in front of the desk, a thin folder in his hand. He set it down on the tabletop and stepped back, waiting. Lorenzo picked up the folder, opened it, and read, Cassandra Mercer, 27 years old, born and raised in Montana. No criminal record, no prior offenses, no issues with the law, no reachable family, parents either deceased or whereabouts unknown. 8 months pregnant, the child's father not identifiable. Hired through a domestic staffing agency 3 weeks ago. No references, no sponsor. Lorenzo read every line, every detail, every small scrap of information Derek's people had gathered. Nothing special, nothing suspicious. Just an ordinary woman with an ordinary life. If you could call carrying a pregnancy alone with nowhere to turn ordinary. He closed the report, laid it on the desk, and fell silent. After a moment, Derek spoke. She's clean, sir. Nothing suspicious. No ties to any family. No sign she's a spy or connected to a rival. She's just a regular housekeeper. Lorenzo didn't answer. He looked out the window, where the paddock could be seen in the distance. Shadow stood there, peaceful. No longer the wild beast that had taken down 3 of his men. Derek understood the conversation was over. He dipped his head and left the room, closing the door behind him. Lorenzo kept staring out the window, the folder still on the desk, and one question kept echoing in his mind with no answer. In the days that followed, a new habit formed, one Lorenzo had never planned. Every morning, just as the sun rose and fog still clung to the Napa Valley hills, Cassie would appear at the stables. She came to Shadow like a sacred ritual, carrying a sugar cube or an apple, and she spent a full hour beside the horse. Shadow listened only to her now. It let her brush its coat, let her stroke it, let her lead it on slow walks around the paddock. The horse that had been a symbol of wildness now followed her like a puppy, eyes tracking her every step, ears angling toward her voice. And Lorenzo watched. From the office window, he looked down at the paddock each morning, coffee in hand, work abandoned on the desk. From the bedroom balcony, he stood in the darkness before dawn and watched her walk the dirt path to the stables. He didn't understand why he did it. He had an empire to run, life and death decisions to make, enemies to face. But every morning he still stood there, watching a pregnant housekeeper stroke his horse, and wondering what it was about her that wouldn't let him look away. One afternoon, Cassie walked along the upper hallway to fetch bed linens from the storage room. She'd memorized the rhythms of this house, knew when to appear and when to disappear, knew which places were safe and which ones to avoid. But today, she took the wrong turn. She passed the oak door of Lorenzo's office, and the door was slightly open. A voice carried from inside, low and cold. Lorenzo's voice. Handle it clean. No trace left behind. Then Derek's voice, short and final. Understood, sir. Cassie stopped dead. Her feet felt nailed to the floor, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She didn't know what they were talking about. She didn't know who would be handled or what needed to leave no trace. But she understood enough. She understood where she was, who she was working for, what kind of world she was living in. The fragments she'd overheard from other staff, the fearful looks whenever someone spoke the name Lorenzo Valenti, the armed guards moving through the mansion like this was a fortress, not a home. She'd tried not to think about those things. She'd chosen to close her eyes, cover her ears, and do her work. But now, standing before that half-open door, she couldn't pretend anymore. Cassie drew a slow, deep breath and forced herself to stay calm. She walked on, quiet, making no sound, as if she'd never stopped, as if she'd never heard anything at all. She took the linens from the storage room, hugged them to her chest, and went back downstairs by the rear staircase. No one saw her. No one knew she'd been there. That night, Cassie lay on the bed in her small room, eyes wide open, staring at the dark ceiling. The baby shifted inside her, maybe feeling its mother's unease. She put a hand on her belly and stroked gently, trying to soothe them both. What kind of world had she stepped into? Whose roof was she living under? The questions spun through her mind like a storm with no place to land. Then she thought of the child inside her, thought of the fact she had nowhere else to go, no one else to lean on, thought of how she'd survived 27 years by not asking questions she didn't need to ask, and not getting tangled in things that weren't hers. The next morning, when the sun was just breaking over the hills, Cassie still walked to the stables as she always did. Shadow lifted its head when it saw her and gave a soft whinny like a greeting. She smiled, reached out to stroke its soft muzzle, and her decision was made. Don't ask. Don't be curious. Don't get involved. She only needed to survive until she gave birth. After that, she'd find a way to leave. But for now, she would become invisible again. A week passed. 7 days, Cassie kept doing housework, kept visiting Shadow each morning, kept pretending she hadn't heard anything in the hallway that day. 7 days she tried to become invisible again, just like her original plan. But this morning, while fog still lay thick over the Napa Valley hills like a fragile white blanket, that plan broke. Cassie was standing in the stable, a grooming brush in her hand, drawing it gently along Shadow's glossy black coat. The horse stood still, eyes half closed, head lowered in complete relaxation. It trusted her. Completely. And somehow, that made Cassie feel a little less alone. She heard footsteps on the dirt before she saw him. Solid, confident steps. The kind made by a man used to owning everything he walked into. Cassie didn't turn around. She kept brushing Shadow as if nothing was happening, as if the most powerful mafia boss in the region hadn't just stepped into her stable. Lorenzo stopped at the stable doorway, one shoulder against the wooden frame, arms folded across his chest. He didn't speak. He only stood there and watched. Cassie could feel his gaze on her back, heavy and cutting, but she didn't let it change the rhythm of her hand. She didn't stop working. She didn't stand up to greet him. She didn't show fear or submission the way everyone else in this mansion did. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft rasp of the brush through the horse's coat and Shadow's steady breathing. Finally, Lorenzo spoke, his voice low and carrying something Cassie couldn't quite name. "You're not afraid of me." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, an acknowledgement of something unusual he'd been watching. Cassie still didn't turn, her hand still moving. "Should I be afraid?" Lorenzo was quiet for a moment, as if weighing his answer. "Most people are. I'm not most people." The words left Cassie's mouth before she could think. She wondered if she'd just crossed a line, if that bluntness would get her into trouble. But when she glanced over her shoulder, she saw something strange on Lorenzo's face. Not anger, almost amusement. Silence settled again, but this time it wasn't as tight. Lorenzo kept watching her work, and when he spoke again, his voice was a little softer. "You grew up in Montana." It wasn't a question. He'd read the report. "Yes," Cassie answered briefly. "Your family. No one left. No one left, or no one left who wants to be found." Cassie's hand paused for a beat. He was sharper than she'd expected. "Both," she answered carefully, but she didn't lie. There was no reason to lie about what was as clear as daylight. Lorenzo walked into the stable, coming closer but still keeping a few feet of distance. Shadow lifted its head to look at him, then turned back to Cassie, as if deciding she mattered more. "And the baby's father?" The question made Cassie's hand stop completely. The brush hovered above the horse's coat, motionless. She felt her body tense, painful memories surging like a wave. But she forced them down, the way she'd done hundreds of times before. She started brushing again, her voice so even it surprised even her. "He didn't want us." 5 simple words. No details, no explanation, no self-pity. Just the barest truth. Lorenzo didn't speak, but Cassie felt something shift in the air. A new tension, not aimed at her, but aimed at someone who wasn't here. She didn't know that in Lorenzo's chest, a fire had just flared up. Anger. Anger at a man he'd never met. The man who'd abandoned the woman standing in front of him. He didn't understand why he felt it. She was only a housekeeper. She had nothing to do with him. But the anger still burned, low and stubborn, refusing to die. Lorenzo cleared his throat, pushing that strange feeling aside. "I have an offer." Cassie finally turned to look at him, calm brown eyes meeting his gray. "You'll officially take care of Shadow, double your current pay, a private room near the stables so it's easier to work." Cassie looked at him for a long moment, measuring, weighing. Then she said, her voice harder, "I don't need your pity." Lorenzo didn't seem offended by the implicit refusal. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying her with an expression she couldn't read. "This isn't pity. It's a job." He took one more step forward, his tone turning more practical. "That horse is worth $2 million. It used to be my symbol of power, and it nearly became a disaster. 15 trained men couldn't control it. But it listens to you like a puppy. That's value, Cassandra. Not charity." Cassie looked at him, then at Shadow, then back at him. She thought of the cramped little room in the staff quarters, thought of the small amount of money she was earning, thought of the baby about to be born and what it would need. She nodded. "All right." Lorenzo nodded back, as if the negotiation had ended exactly the way he'd expected. "You'll have a private room starting tomorrow." He turned and walked toward the stable door, but before he stepped outside, he stopped. His back was still to her, but his voice softened, carrying a note Cassie had never heard from him before. And Cassandra. She looked up, waiting. You did well, with Shadow. Then he walked away, disappearing into the fog still draped over the hills. Cassie stood there, the brush still in her hand, watching his back until it dissolved completely into white. It was the first time she'd heard him say something that wasn't an order, and she didn't know what she was supposed to feel about that. 2 weeks passed like a dream Cassie didn't dare believe was real. She moved into the new room the very next day after her conversation with Lorenzo, exactly as he'd promised. The room was small but private, in an outbuilding near the stables, with a large window that looked out over the lush green hills of Napa Valley. There was a real bed, not the worn-out spring mattress in the staff quarters. There was a small table by the window where she could sit and look outside. There was a private bathroom with hot water that ran steady. Small things most people took for granted, but to Cassie they were luxuries she'd never dared to dream of. Her life was steadier than it had ever been. Every morning she woke as the sun came up, walked the short distance to the stables, and spent time with Shadow. She brushed him, led him on slow walks around the paddock, talked to him about nothing and everything. The horse that had once been a symbol of wildness had changed completely. He was gentle, obedient, and he even seemed happy whenever Cassie appeared. He'd whinny once, run to her, and press his head into her shoulder like a giant puppy. The bond between them was something no one could explain, but everyone could see. And Lorenzo saw it too. He began showing up at the stables every morning, at first by coincidence, then gradually as a habit. He said he came to check on Shadow, to make sure his $2 million investment was being cared for properly. But everyone knew who he was really coming for. The guards traded looks when he walked past. The house staff whispered behind hands, but no one dared say anything to his face. In those mornings, they talked. At first it was only short lines about work, about Shadow, about the weather, but slowly the conversations grew longer, easier. Lorenzo asked about life in Montana, about the horses she'd cared for, about the brutal winters and the short summers on the plains. Cassie answered, cautious at first, then more natural as she realized he was truly listening. He listened more than he spoke, something she'd heard he rarely did with anyone. He would stand with his shoulder against the fence, eyes drifting toward the hills, and let her tell him about a life he couldn't imagine. One afternoon, after Cassie finished feeding Shadow, Maggie appeared at the stable door with a tense look on her face. Mr. Valenti wants to see you in the main house. Cassie felt her stomach clench. What had she done wrong? Had she said something she shouldn't have? Were those morning conversations a mistake? She followed Maggie into the main house, her steps growing heavier with every footfall. When she reached the great sitting room, she saw Lorenzo standing by the window, and beside him was a middle-aged man she'd never seen before. The man had salt and pepper hair, a kind face, and a black leather bag that looked like a doctor's case set on the table. Lorenzo turned when he heard her. Cassandra? This is Dr. Harrison Webb, my family doctor. Cassie stopped short, not understanding what was happening. I don't, she began, but Lorenzo cut her off. You're 8 months pregnant and working from morning to night. You need to be checked. His voice wasn't a command, but it wasn't a suggestion either. It was a fact he was stating, and he wasn't accepting objections. Cassie wanted to refuse. She wanted to say she didn't need anyone's help, that she'd taken care of herself for 27 years, that she didn't want to owe anyone. But before she could open her mouth, Dr. Webb smiled at her, the warm smile of a father. Just a checkup, Miss Mercer, to make sure the baby's healthy, nothing to worry about. Cassie looked at Lorenzo, but he didn't look back. He'd turned toward his desk, pretending to study a stack of papers as if this had nothing to do with him. As if calling his private doctor to examine a housekeeper was the most normal thing in the world. She agreed, not because she wanted to, but because she knew it was the right thing for the child inside her. Dr. Webb examined her carefully, thoroughly, asking about diet, sleep, unusual symptoms. He listened to the baby's heartbeat, checked her blood pressure, measured her belly. When he finished, he gave her a reassuring smile. The baby is very healthy, Miss Mercer. Strong, steady heartbeat, size right on track. But you need more rest. 8 months isn't the time to overwork. After the doctor left, Cassie remained in the sitting room, unsure whether she should go or stay. Lorenzo still stood at the desk, still pretending to read papers. You didn't have to do that, Cassie said, her voice soft but carrying something she couldn't quite name. Lorenzo lifted his gaze to her, gray eyes meeting brown. I know. 2 words. No explanation. No reason. No defense. Just I know. As if that said everything. Cassie didn't ask more. She dipped her head slightly and left the room. But she could feel his eyes following her until she disappeared through the doorway. In the mansion kitchen, Rosa was preparing dinner when Maggie came in. He asked me what Cassie likes to eat, Rosa said, her surprise impossible to hide. He's never asked what anyone likes to eat. He just orders and we do it. Maggie looked out the window, where she could see Lorenzo walking toward the stables even though Cassie wasn't there anymore. He's in love, she said, her voice holding a little sadness and a little hope. He just doesn't know it yet. That night, Cassie lay in her new room, a hand on her belly, feeling the baby stir inside. Moonlight slipped through the window and spilled over the distant hills, and somewhere in the stables, Shadow slept in peace. For the first time in a long time, maybe for the first time in her life, Cassie felt like she could hope. Late at night, Lorenzo sat alone in the office on the mansion's 2nd floor. The whiskey in his glass was half gone, the amber catching the pale gold of the desk lamp. The room lay in darkness, except for the small pool of light around his desk, where important papers waited for his attention. But he wasn't looking at the papers. He was looking out the window, toward the small building near the stables. Light still burned in Cassie's room, a warm yellow square in the black night. He wondered what she was doing. Reading, thinking about the baby that would be born soon. Or maybe she was awake too, like him, with thoughts that wouldn't let her sleep. He lifted the glass to his mouth, took a sip, and let the burn slide down his throat. Memory came without being asked, the way it always did when he sat alone in the dark. 24 years ago, Lorenzo was 12, standing beside his mother's coffin in the great room of the old estate. She lay there in the white dress she loved, hair brushed smooth, eyes closed as if she were sleeping. But she wasn't sleeping. She would never wake again. The Caruso family had sent her back as a message to his father, a reminder that in this world, no one was allowed to have a weakness, and his mother had been Don Valenti's greatest weakness. His father stood beside the coffin, back straight as an oak, face hard as granite. He didn't shed a tear. Not one sob, not a single crack of pain showed on the carved, severe lines of his face. Lorenzo wanted to cry, wanted to scream, wanted to smash everything around him, but he looked at his father and learned how to swallow his tears. After the funeral, when the mourners had left and the house sank into a deadly silence, his father called him into the study. Lorenzo remembered the smell of cigars and leather in that room, remembered his father's cold eyes as they fixed on him, remembered every word that came from the thin lips of the man who'd made him. Love is weakness, Lorenzo. They killed your mother because I loved her, because I let her become my weakness. Never let anyone become your weakness. Never. At 12 years old, Lorenzo stood in that room and watched his father build the first wall around his heart. 20 years ago, Lorenzo was 16, standing in the underground shooting range beneath the estate. A pistol sat in his hand, heavy and cold, and he learned how to squeeze the trigger without shaking. His father stood behind him, watching, judging, never satisfied. Lorenzo learned to shoot that year, learned to fight, learned to interrogate, learned how to make people afraid with nothing but a look, and most of all, he learned how to feel nothing. His father taught him everything he needed to survive in this world. Trust is stupid, his father said, voice cold as ice. Everyone has a price. Pay enough, and anyone will betray you. Remember that. Lorenzo remembered. He carved it into bone, into flesh, into every cell in his body. He trusted no one. He loved no one. He never let anyone close enough to hurt him. 10 years ago, his father died, a sudden heart attack in the middle of the night, and Lorenzo inherited the Valenti Empire at 26. He stood by his father's hospital bed in those final hours, watching the man who'd been a symbol of power become small and frail beneath white sheets. His father didn't apologize, didn't speak of love, didn't say anything at all except instructions about business, about the empire, about enemies to watch. To the very end, he was Don Valenti, not a father. After his father died, Lorenzo built the walls higher, colder, crueler. He became the new Don Valenti, more terrifying than his father had ever been. No one dared come close. No one dared meet his eyes. He had everything, money, power, his enemies' fear, and yet he had nothing at all. He'd never had a real relationship, never had anyone he could call a friend, a lover, family, only transactions, only advantage, only towering walls and a frozen heart. Lorenzo looked down into his glass and saw his own face distorted in the amber liquid. He wondered what Cassie thought of him. Was she afraid of him? Did she despise him? Could she see the blood on his hands, even if he'd washed them clean long ago? She looked at him with those calm eyes. No fear, no submission. As if she could see through every layer he'd built over 24 years. And the most frightening part was that he wanted her to see. He wanted her to see him, the real man, not the Mafia boss, not Don Valenti, just Lorenzo. But did that real man still exist? Or had he died with his mother 24 years ago, in a room that smelled of lilies and tears that never fell? Lorenzo drained the whiskey and set the glass down on the desk. He rose, walked to the window, and stared out. The light in Cassie's room was still on, like a small lighthouse in an ocean of darkness. He turned off the office lamp, letting the room sink into night, but his eyes still wouldn't leave that lit window in the distance. He couldn't sleep that night. 30 miles south of the Valenti estate, in an old villa hidden among endless vineyards, another meeting was underway. This was Caruso territory, the blood enemy of the Valenti line, the family that had killed Lorenzo's mother 24 years ago. Bennett Caruso sat in his study, 52 years old, silver hair slicked back, hawk-sharp eyes fixed on the photographs spread across an oak table. He'd inherited his position from his father, the man who'd ordered the murder of the old Don Valenti's wife, and he'd never stopped looking for a way to bring Lorenzo down. Vince Caruso, his son, 28, stood across from him with a smug expression. He was his father's younger copy, with the same cold eyes and the same cruel smile, but without the patience and calculation Bennett had honed over decades. "Look at this," Vince said, sliding another photo onto the table. A long-distance shot, but clear enough to make out two figures. A small woman stood beside a black horse in a paddock, and a man stood farther back, watching her. Valenti cares about her, a pregnant housekeeper. Bennett picked up the photo and narrowed his eyes. Cares how? He gave her a private room near the stables, not in the staff quarters. Vince answered, his tone edged with contempt. He called in his private doctor to examine her, and every morning he goes down to the stables, stands there talking to her for hours. Valenti, the guy who never talks to anyone longer than 5 minutes, now stands around chatting with some pregnant little maid. Bennett set the photo down, leaned back in his chair, and a slow smile formed on his mouth. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a predator that had just caught the scent of prey's weakness. "Lorenzo Valenti," he said, repeating what the entire underworld had accepted for 10 years. "The man with no weakness. He's finally got one." Vince nodded, eyes bright with excitement. "We use her as leverage. We grab her, bring her here, then force Valenti to hand over the southern territory. He took that area from us 5 years ago. It's time to take it back." Bennett went quiet, his fingers tapping lightly on the tabletop. He wasn't reckless like his son. He'd lived long enough in this world to know rushed moves often ended in death. "Be careful," he said, slow but carrying the weight of an order. "Valenti isn't easy to provoke. His father was dangerous enough, but he's worse. Colder, more ruthless. If we touch something he cares about and we fail, he'll burn everything to the ground." Vince stepped closer, bracing both hands on the table and leaning toward his father. "That's exactly why we need a hostage. He won't risk anything if she's in our hands. A pregnant woman, weak, no way to defend herself. Valenti will do whatever we say if he wants her alive." Bennett studied his son, weighing it. The plan made sense. If Lorenzo Valenti truly cared about this woman, if she really was his weakness, then this was the opening they'd been waiting for all these years. A chance to topple their enemy without blood, or at least without their blood. "All right," Bennett said, nodding once. "But it has to be clean. No trace left behind. And we wait for the right moment." Vince smiled, the smile of a man who believed he'd won before the fight even began. That night, far from the Caruso villa, Cassie was walking from the stables back to her room. She'd stayed later than usual to brush Shadow and check the wounds on his neck, now almost fully healed. The familiar dirt path from the stables to the small building where she lived was lit by thin moonlight. She'd walked it dozens of times, safe and quiet, but tonight something felt different. She felt it before she could explain it, a chill sliding up her spine, as if someone were watching from the dark. She stopped and turned her head, scanning the night. Nothing, only dark rows of trees cutting their shapes against the sky, silent hills, and the constant rasp of crickets. No one, but her instincts. The instincts that had kept her alive for 27 years, were screaming that something wasn't right. She quickened her pace, steps turning urgent, one arm wrapping her belly as if to shield the child inside. She didn't run because she knew running would make everything worse, but she moved as fast as her heavy body allowed. When she reached her room and locked the door behind her, her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She leaned her back against the door, breathing deep, trying to steady herself. Maybe it was imagination. Maybe it was the paranoia of a pregnant woman alone in the dark. Maybe it was nothing at all, but she couldn't shake the feeling. The next morning, when Maggie came to call her for breakfast, Cassie told her about the night before. She hadn't meant to, but when Maggie asked why she looked exhausted, the words spilled out on their own. Maggie listened, her face turning grave, and then she disappeared to find Derek. Derek told Lorenzo. And before Cassie could even understand what was happening, 2 guards were posted near her building. They didn't follow her. They didn't stand right at her door. But she could see them at a distance, always within sight. Lorenzo didn't come to see her that day. There was no mourning at the stables like usual. But when Cassie looked up at the mansion balcony, she saw his silhouette there, looking down, and she knew that even without a word, he was protecting her. She didn't know she'd just become a target. Didn't know that somewhere in the darkness, Lorenzo's enemies were already planning to use her as a piece on a board in a war she didn't even know existed. 3 days had passed since the night Cassie felt someone watching her. 3 days with 2 guards always somewhere within sight. 3 days with Lorenzo not showing up at the stables but his silhouette always on the balcony, looking down. Cassie tried to convince herself everything was normal, that she was being protected, that there was nothing to worry about. But deep inside, she knew something was coming. Late that afternoon, Cassie walked from the kitchen back to her room with a small paper bag in her hand. Rosa had wrapped up a few cookies and some fruit for her, saying she needed to eat more because the baby was growing fast. Her belly was heavier every day. 8.5 months now, only a few weeks left. She moved more slowly than before, her steps heavier, her back aching more. But she still tried to do everything herself, not wanting to depend on anyone, not wanting to become a burden. The hallway that led from the kitchen to the back of the mansion was empty at this hour. This was when the guards changed shifts, a 15-minute gap when the old team pulled out and the new team hadn't taken position yet. Cassie didn't know that. She only knew the silence felt wrong, that the sound of her footsteps echoed on the stone like drums in a cave. She was halfway down when she saw them. 2 men stepped out from a side door ahead of her, blocking the passage. They wore maintenance uniforms, dark blue shirts and khaki pants, but Cassie had never seen them once in all the time she'd been here. She knew most of the staff, the ones who nodded to her each morning, the ones who whispered about her behind her back. These 2 were strangers. The first was tall, broad-shouldered, with a rough face and a long scar running from his temple down to his cheekbone. The second was shorter but solid, eyes cold as stone, not a flicker of feeling in them. They stood there, filling the narrow space, looking at her with a gaze she'd seen before, a predator looking at prey. "Are you Cassandra Mercer?" the scarred man asked, his voice low and raspy, like he'd smoked all his life. Cassie took 1 step back, instinct making her wrap an arm around her belly. The paper bag slipped from her hand, cookies rolling across the cold stone floor. "Who are you?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady even as her heart hammered like it was about to burst. The second man stepped forward, his mouth curling into a cold smile. "Someone Lorenzo Valenti cares about." Cassie felt her blood run cold. "I'm just a housekeeper. I don't know anything about Mr. Valenti." The scarred man laughed, a dry sound that bounced off the empty hallway. "Housekeepers don't get the boss's private doctor called in. Housekeepers don't get a private room near the stables. And housekeepers sure as hell don't make Lorenzo Valenti stand on a balcony every day like some idiot in love." They moved closer, step by step, slow, like they knew she had nowhere to go. Cassie backed up, backing up until her spine hit the icy stone wall behind her. She looked around in desperation, but the hallway was empty. No one. No footsteps. No voices. Just her and 2 men coming toward her with an intention she didn't dare name. "You're coming with us," the second man said, his tone leaving no room to negotiate. "Quiet, good, and nobody gets hurt. Especially the little one in your belly." Tears rose in Cassie's throat, but she swallowed them down. She couldn't cry. She couldn't be weak. The child inside her depended on her, and she would do anything to protect it. The scarred man reached out, going for her arm, and Cassie acted. She screamed, a sound that tore through the hallway's silence and rang off the stone walls like an alarm bell. At the same time, She drove her heel into the scarred man's shin with everything she had, the impact cracking against bone with a sharp snap. He cursed, lost his balance, and pitched forward. The second man moved faster than she expected. He lunged, one hand fisting in her hair, yanking hard enough to make her cry out in pain, but Cassie didn't stop. She clawed at his face, nails cutting into skin, leaving long red tracks down his cheek. She screamed again, screamed until her throat burned raw. He slapped her. His hand slammed into her cheek with enough force to whip her head sideways, enough to send stars exploding behind her eyes. She went down, knees striking the stone, but even as she fell, her arms wrapped tight around her belly, protecting the child inside with everything she had. Then she heard it. Running footsteps, footsteps pounding down the hallway, fast and urgent, like thunder closing in. Stop. Let her go. Derek Kane's voice cracked like lightning, full of authority and rage. Cassie lifted her head and saw Derek and 3 other guards charging toward them, guns already drawn, faces hard with violence. The 2 men who'd attacked her exchanged a look and tried to run, but they didn't have a chance. Derek caught the scarred man in seconds and slammed him to the ground with a strike to the back of the neck. 2 other guards handled the second man, wrenching his arm behind his back and driving his face down into the stone. The click of handcuffs sounded as they were restrained. Derek dropped to one knee beside Cassie, his usual cold face now filled with worry. "Miss Mercer, are you all right? Are you hurt?" Cassie sat against the wall, her whole body shaking out of control. Her cheek was swollen and burning. Her knee stung where the skin was scraped raw. But she didn't cry. Not one tear fell. Her arms were still wrapped around her belly, and she felt the baby move inside, as if telling her it was still there, still okay. "The baby," she whispered, voice trembling. "The baby's okay. I think the baby's okay." Then she heard other footsteps. Faster, more frantic. The sound of someone running, not walking. She lifted her head toward the end of the hallway. Lorenzo appeared there, face white as paper, eyes wide with panic. He froze for a beat, staring at what was in front of him, at Cassie slumped against the wall with her cheeks swollen and her hands on her belly. And something in his eyes changed. Something shattered, or maybe something was finally admitted. Lorenzo ran to her, not walking fast, not hurrying, but running. For the first time in their lives, the people who worked in the Valenti mansion saw their boss run. His footsteps thundered on the stone floor, quick and urgent, as if every passing second was 1 second too long. His face was white as paper, drained of all color, and in his eyes was something no one had ever seen before. Panic. Pure fear, uncovered and unhidden. He shoved Derek aside, not roughly, but not gently either, and dropped to his knees in front of Cassie. His knees hit the cold stone and he didn't even notice. His hands shook as he reached for her shoulder, so light it barely had weight, as if he was afraid that even the slightest pressure would make her break. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice trembling, no longer the cold, commanding voice everyone was used to. "Is the baby okay?" Cassie looked up at him, into those gray eyes filled with worry, and she felt something strange tighten in her chest. This wasn't the Mafia boss. This was just a man who was afraid of losing something he maybe hadn't even named yet. "I'm okay," she whispered, her voice still shaking. "We're okay." Lorenzo closed his eyes and let out a long breath, as if he'd just been brought back from the edge, as if he'd been holding his breath from the moment he heard until this moment right here. When he opened his eyes, his gaze landed on the bruise swelling red on her cheek. His jaw locked, a muscle jumping beneath the skin, and the worry in his eyes slowly turned into something else, colder, more dangerous. "Who did this?" he asked, and now his voice was ice, each word cut from steel. Derek stepped closer, his tone grave. "Caruso men, sir. We caught both of them." Lorenzo rose slowly and turned toward the 2 men in cuffs, face down on the stone. He walked over, stopped in front of them, and Cassie saw something in his eyes when he looked down. Not anger. Anger could be understood, could be controlled. This was something far more dangerous. This was destruction held tight, waiting to be unleashed. "Take them to the basement," Lorenzo ordered, his voice empty of feeling. "I'll come down after." 2 guards hauled the men up and dragged them away. The scarred one looked at Lorenzo with defiance. But when his eyes met the boss's, the defiance vanished, replaced by a flicker of fear he couldn't hide. Lorenzo turned back to Cassie. His face softened a little as he looked at her, but his voice still carried an order that couldn't be refused. "Bring her into the main house, the room next to mine. Now." Cassie opened her mouth to protest. "I don't need." But Lorenzo had already dropped back down, eye level with her again, and looked straight at her with a gaze she couldn't ignore. "This isn't a suggestion, Cassandra," he said, low but heavy. "They came for you. They'll come back. And next time, we might not get here in time." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice softened by the smallest degree. "You stay next to me, where it's safest. I won't let anyone touch you again." For the first time, Cassie didn't argue. She nodded and let Maggie and a guard help her to her feet, then followed them into the main house. The room they brought her to was on the second floor, right beside Lorenzo's master bedroom. It was 5 times the size of her old room, with a large bed dressed in white sheets, a mahogany vanity, and a wide window looking out over the Napa Valley spread below. It was beautiful in a way that didn't feel real, like she'd stepped into another world. 30 minutes later, Dr. Webb arrived. He came in with the familiar medical bag, his face kind but serious. Lorenzo stood outside the door, not entering, but not leaving either. He stayed there like a statue, back against the wall, eyes fixed on nothing, waiting. Dr. Webb examined her more carefully than before. He checked the baby's heartbeat, took her blood pressure, asked about pain, about where she'd been hit. He gently treated the bruise on her cheek, the scrape on her knee, and the smaller bruises on her arms. When he finished, he gave her a reassuring smile. "The baby's fine, Miss Mercer. Heartbeat normal. No signs of anything abnormal. She's a strong little girl." He paused, his voice turning more serious. "But you're in shock. Your body needs time to recover. Complete rest for a few days. No work, no stress." "All right," Cassie nodded. "Thank you, doctor." Dr. Webb stepped out, and Cassie heard him speaking with Lorenzo just outside the door. "She's fine. The baby's fine. No serious injury." His voice dropped lower. "But she's only got a few weeks left until delivery. In this time, she needs protection. Any major stress could put both mother and baby at risk." "I understand," Lorenzo answered, short and stone-hard. After the doctor left, Lorenzo appeared in her doorway. He didn't step inside, only stood on the threshold, as if there was an invisible line he didn't dare cross. "If you need anything, tell me," he said, softer than usual. "Anything." Cassie looked at him, at the man standing there in a perfect suit with exhaustion in his eyes, and she asked the question that had been circling in her head since the moment it happened. "I only need to know one thing. Why? Why did they want to take me?" Lorenzo was silent for a long time. He looked out the window at the valley sinking into dusk, and when he turned back to her, his eyes held something she'd never seen in him before. "Because they think you matter to me." The answer was almost shockingly simple. Cassie felt her heart beating faster. "Do I matter?" Lorenzo didn't answer. He only stood there, looking at her, and in his gray eyes was everything she needed to know. He didn't speak, but his eyes said it all. Then he turned away and walked into the hallway's darkness, leaving her alone in the unfamiliar room. Cassie lay down in the strange bed, pulled the blanket up to her chest, and stared at the high ceiling. She was in a strange room, in a strange world, under the protection of a man she still didn't fully understand. And with a frightening clarity, she realized she'd become the weakness of the most powerful Mafia boss in Napa Valley. 3 days had passed since the attack in the hallway. The bruise on Cassie's cheek had faded, shifting from red-purple to yellow-green, and her knee no longer hurt when she walked. But there were wounds that didn't live on the skin, wounds you couldn't see, and they didn't heal that fast. Every night she lay in the large room beside Lorenzo's, closing her eyes and trying to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the scarred man's face again, heard their cold voices again, felt the hand fisting in her hair and yanking hard. She knew she was safe. Knew guards stood watch right outside the door. Knew Lorenzo wouldn't let anyone touch her again. But fear didn't listen to reason. On the 3rd night, at 2 o'clock in the morning, Cassie gave up trying to sleep. Her back ached. The baby inside her wouldn't stop moving, and the walls of the unfamiliar room seemed to press down on her. She needed air. She needed water. She needed to escape the bed, even for a moment. She draped a thin robe over her shoulders and stepped into the hallway. The mansion was silent at this hour, lit only by small corner lamps and the soft sound of her footsteps on the carpet. She went down the stairs toward the kitchen, a route she'd memorized in the past few days. The kitchen was dark, washed only by moonlight spilling through the wide window and pooling on the stone floor like silver. Cassie stepped in, meaning to get a glass of water, and realized she wasn't the only one awake. Lorenzo sat at the small table by the window, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his face half lit by moonlight and half drowned in shadow. He didn't look up when she entered, as if he'd known she was coming before she did. Cassie stopped, awkward. "I'm sorry, I didn't know someone was here. I'll—" "Sit down." Lorenzo cut her off, his voice not an order, just a tired invitation. "I don't bite." She hesitated, then walked over and sat in the chair across from him. They sat in silence for a long time, Lorenzo staring down at the whiskey in his hand, Cassie looking out the window where the moon was painting the distant hills in silver. Neither of them spoke, but the quiet didn't feel uncomfortable. It carried something strange, as if they'd grown used to each other's presence enough not to need words. Lorenzo spoke first, his voice low in the dark. "What are you most afraid of?" The question was so unexpected, Cassie took a moment to respond. She thought about it, truly. Not the easy answer, but the thing that haunted her in the sleepless nights. "That my child won't have anywhere to call home," she said slowly, each word pulled from deep in her chest. "That no one will be waiting for her. That no one will want her except me. I'll be all she has, and I don't know if I'm enough. I don't know if I can give her a good life, or if I'm just dragging her into the same spiral I've been trapped in my whole life." Silence. Lorenzo didn't speak, but she could feel him listening, truly listening, not just waiting for his turn. Then he asked another question, his voice lower. "Are you afraid of me?" Cassie looked up, meeting his eyes. In the dark, his gaze wasn't as cold as it was in daylight. It was only tired, and maybe lonely. "I used to be," she admitted, "but I'm not anymore." "Why?" Cassie tilted her head and studied him for a long moment before she answered. "Because I see you. I really see you," she said, her voice gentle but steady. "Behind all the orders, the guards, these rooms, you're afraid too, like Shadow on that first day. You build walls so high no one can get close, but inside those walls, you're just a man trying not to be hurt one more time." Lorenzo set his whiskey down on the table. He looked at her, and in that moment the mask he'd worn for 24 years seemed to crack. He stared at her as if she'd driven a knife into his chest, not to cause pain, but to pry open a door that had been locked for a long time. "No one's ever said that to me," he said, his voice rough. Cassie gave a small smile, her first in days. Maybe no one's dared. Silence stretched between them, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not distance, but understanding. Two strangers seeing each other in the dark, seeing the wounds they kept hidden, and not running. Cassie stood, meaning to return to her room, but Lorenzo's hand closed around hers, gentle, not forcing, just a quiet request. "Stay," he said, his voice low as breath. "A little longer." Cassie looked down at his hand holding hers, warm and trembling slightly. Then she sat back down. They didn't say much after that. They only sat there in the dark kitchen lit by moonlight, two lonely people finding a small piece of peace in each other's presence. And they stayed that way, in soft silence, until the first light of dawn slipped through the window and turned the whole room gold. 2 days after that night in the kitchen, Lorenzo left the estate in the late afternoon. He didn't tell anyone where he was going, only gave Derek a short order to ready the car and his 6 most trusted guards. Cassie watched the glossy black convoy roll out through the gates from her bedroom window, and she knew this wasn't a normal business trip. There was something in the way Lorenzo moved that morning, in the way he didn't look at her when he passed, in the tension across his shoulders she'd learned to recognize. He was going to settle something, and she knew it had to do with her. The convoy stopped in front of an Italian restaurant on the outskirts, far from residential streets, a place that had been closed for years but kept up as neutral ground for meetings no one wanted spoken about. Lorenzo stepped out of the car, Derek and 6 guards closing around him, and they went inside. The restaurant was dark, lit only by a few lamps in the center where a table had been set. Bennett Caruso sat there, silver hair slicked back, hawk eyes watching Lorenzo enter with the pleased interest of a snake studying prey. Vince stood behind his father, arms folded, smug smile on his mouth. "Lorenzo," Bennett spoke first, his voice wrapped in false friendliness. "Long time, since your father's funeral, right?" Lorenzo didn't sit. He stood there, face carved from stone, eyes cold as ice. "You sent men into my house. You threatened my people," Bennett shrugged, as if they were discussing the weather. "She's just a pregnant housekeeper, a nobody. No family, no power. Why would a Valenti care about someone like that?" "That's none of your business," Lorenzo said, voice empty of feeling. Bennett laughed, a dry sound in the hollow restaurant. You've got a weakness now, Lorenzo. After all these years, after everything your father taught you, you let a woman become your weakness. He tilted his head, eyes sharp. Your father would be disappointed. Lorenzo walked closer, slow, one step at a time, until he was only a few feet from Bennett. Vince tensed, a hand drifting toward his waistband, but Bennett lifted a hand to stop him. Lorenzo leaned over, planted both hands on the table, and bent forward until his face was inches from Bennett's. When he spoke, his voice was so low it was almost a whisper, but every word carried the weight of thunder. Listen to me, Bennett. I'm only saying this once. He paused, letting what came next sink in. Touch her again, and I wipe out the entire Caruso bloodline. Not a threat, a promise. He tipped his head slightly, gray eyes winter cold. You know me. You know I can do it. You know I won't hesitate. Bennett looked into Lorenzo's eyes, and for the first time in his life he saw something he'd never seen in the old enemy's son. Not anger, not hatred. A willingness to burn everything down, to set the whole world on fire if it was necessary. No hesitation. No regret. This wasn't the Lorenzo Valenti Bennett thought he knew. The cold, calculating one. This was a man with something to lose, and willing to do anything to protect it. Bennett was silent for a long moment, weighing it. He'd lived long enough to know when to push and when to step back, and this was the time to step back. All right, he said finally, his voice no longer challenging. She's not worth a war. Lorenzo straightened and looked down at Bennett with a hard, icy stare. That's right, walk away, and don't let me see your men near my estate again. He turned and walked out without looking back. By the time Lorenzo returned to the estate, night had fully fallen. The lights in the house were on, and somewhere in the darkness a figure sat on the front steps. Cassie. She sat there with both hands on her belly, eyes fixed on the road leading up to the mansion. She didn't know what she was waiting for. She only knew she couldn't sit still in her room, couldn't read, couldn't do anything until he came back. Lorenzo stopped in front of her and looked down. His face showed no emotion, but the tension in his shoulders was gone. Where did you go? Cassie asked softly. To settle a problem. Cassie looked at him, into his eyes, and she understood something had happened. Something she didn't need the details of. Something that belonged to the dark world he lived in. She didn't ask more. Thank you, she said simply. Lorenzo studied her for a long moment. You don't need to know what I did. I know enough, Cassie said. Lorenzo nodded, one small nod, then stepped past her and went inside. The threat had been handled. Cassie was safe. But when she rose and followed him into the house, she knew something between them had shifted, and they both knew it. A week had passed since the confrontation with Bennett Caruso. Life inside the Valenti mansion settled into a new rhythm, a rhythm Cassie never thought would become familiar. She was still in the room in the main house, right beside Lorenzo's. No one suggested she move. She didn't ask. It seemed like an unspoken agreement they both accepted without ever putting it into words. Her belly was huge now, 9 months, heavy enough that every step was harder than the one before it. Dr. Webb came once a week and said the baby would arrive in 2 to 3 weeks. Every time she heard that, Cassie put a hand on her stomach and felt a mix of excitement and fear she couldn't put into words. That afternoon, Cassie stood beside Shadow in the paddock the way she did every day. The late sun turned everything gold. The distant hills, the grass at her feet, the old wooden fence, the glossy black coat of the horse beside her. The world looked as if it had been brushed with warm honey, beautiful in a way that didn't feel real, like a painting from a dream she'd never dared to have. Shadow had changed completely from the wild horse she'd met that first day. It stood quietly at her side, gentle and patient, like a faithful guardian. Whenever anyone came near, it would lift its head to check, then turn back to her as if to say, "It's all right, I'm still here." The horse lowered its head and pressed its soft muzzle to Cassie's belly. She gave a small laugh and lifted her hand to stroke its head, feeling the smooth coat beneath her palm. And then the baby kicked. Hard, clear, a kick so strong Cassie could see her belly rise at one point. Shadow felt it. The horse went still as stone, completely motionless, ears tipped forward. It didn't move, it didn't huff, as if it had gathered every ounce of attention on the miracle happening right beneath its nose. Cassie held her breath, one hand on the horse's head, the other on her belly, taking in the moment. The baby kicked again, and Shadow let out a soft little whicker, the gentlest sound she'd ever heard from him. She didn't know someone was watching. Lorenzo was walking out of the main house, meaning to go somewhere, something he needed to handle. but he stopped when he saw the scene in the paddock. The small woman with the swollen belly, the massive black horse bowed beside her. Late sunlight wrapped around them like a halo. It was so beautiful he forgot how to breathe. His feet moved before he could tell them to. He walked toward them, through the paddock gate, across the sun-dried grass, until he stood only a few feet away. Cassie lifted her head at the sound of footsteps, and when she saw him, she didn't look surprised. As if she'd known he would come, as if she'd been waiting without realizing it. "He can feel the baby," she said, her voice bright with wonder and joy. "He knows there's something in here." Lorenzo stood beside her, looking at Shadow's muzzle still resting against her belly, looking at the tight round curve beneath her simple dress. He'd stood in front of the most dangerous enemies. He'd faced death without a tremor, but now, in front of a pregnant woman and an unborn child, he felt himself shake in a way he couldn't explain. "Maybe I could," he asked, hesitating, not even sure what he was asking permission for. Cassie looked at him, into his eyes, and she saw something there she'd never seen before. Vulnerability, longing, and the fear of being refused. She took his hand. His hand was warm, large, rough, with calluses from years of carrying the weight of an empire. She placed it on her belly, right where the baby had kicked. They stood like that for a while, in silence, waiting. Then the baby kicked straight into Lorenzo's palm. He froze, eyes widening, breath stopping in his chest. He stared down at his hand on her belly, then at Cassie, then back at her belly, as if he couldn't believe what he'd just felt, as if he'd touched something holy, something beyond everything he'd ever known in his cold, violent world. "Strong," he whispered, his voice low and trembling slightly. Like her mother. Cassie felt tears rise and spill over. She didn't stop them. She cried, but not from sadness, not from fear. She cried because for the first time in a long time, maybe for the first time in her life, she didn't feel alone. Someone was standing beside her. Someone was touching her child with tenderness and wonder. Someone was looking at her as if she mattered. 3 lives stood in the golden afternoon. Shadow, muzzle still pressed to her belly, loyal and gentle. Cassie, tears on her cheeks and a smile on her mouth. Lorenzo, hand still on her belly, feeling every small movement of the child inside. No one said anything else. They didn't need to. The late sunlight kept turning everything gold, and in that moment the outside world stopped existing. There was only them, and the miracle they were sharing. That night, after dinner, Maggie came to Cassie's room and said Lorenzo wanted to see her in his office. Cassie felt her heart jump into a faster rhythm, not knowing if it was worry or something else. She got up and followed Maggie to the 2nd floor, moving slowly with the weight of her belly and the ache in her legs. 9 months of pregnancy had drained her strength, but she kept going anyway, the way she'd kept going for 27 years. When she reached the office, the oak door was already open. Lorenzo stood by the large window overlooking the valley, his back to her. He wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. No suit, no tie, looking less cold than he usually did. The lamp on his desk cast a warm yellow shadow across the wooden floor, and in the room's hush, Cassie could hear her own heartbeat. Lorenzo turned when he heard her steps. In his hand were 2 ivory envelopes, thick and formal. He gestured toward the chair in front of his desk. "Sit down." Cassie sat, both hands resting on her belly, eyes on him with worry she couldn't hide. "Is something wrong?" Lorenzo didn't answer right away. He came closer and handed her the first envelope. "Open it." Cassie took the envelope, her hands trembling slightly as she tore it open. Inside was a stack of legal documents, stamped and signed. She read line by line, and when she understood what it meant, her eyes widened until she could barely believe it. "This is Shadow's ownership papers." Lorenzo nodded, his face unreadable, but his eyes softening as they stayed on her. "You gentled him. He belongs to you, completely. From now on, he's your horse, not mine." Cassie shook her head, trying to give the papers back. "I can't take this. That horse is worth $2 million. I'm just—" "You can," Lorenzo cut in, gentle but unmovable. "And you will. Shadow doesn't listen to anyone but you. He chose you, not the other way around. I'm only doing what should be done." Before Cassie could say anything else, Lorenzo handed her the 2nd envelope. This one was lighter, and when she opened it, a key dropped into her palm, along with a sheet of paper. She read the paper, and this time she couldn't speak at all. "The house on the east side of the estate," Lorenzo explained, his voice low and even. "I had it renovated over the past week. 3 bedrooms. One for you, one for the baby, one as a spare. A private kitchen, a private bathroom, a private entrance. You'll have your own space. Cassie stared at the key in her hand, small and cold, but carrying the weight of an entire world. Lorenzo, I can't. No rent, he went on as if she hadn't spoken. No conditions, no strings, just a home. For you, for your child, a place you can call yours. Cassie stood, the key still in her hand, and walked closer. She stopped in front of him, looking up at the man who'd saved her, protected her, given her more than anyone ever had. Why? She whispered. Why are you doing all this? I'm just a housekeeper. I have nothing to give you. I have nothing. Lorenzo turned back to the window, staring into the night outside. He was silent for a long time. Long enough Cassie thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, his voice low and carrying something she'd never heard from him before. Fragile, honest, real. Because you reminded me of something I thought I'd forgotten. He paused and drew in a deep breath. That strength doesn't need cruelty. For 24 years I believed that to be strong I had to be cold. To survive I had to be ruthless. But you walked into that paddock with a sugar cube in your hand, and you did what 15 men with ropes and strength couldn't do. He turned back to her, and in his eyes was something she'd seen in the sleepless kitchen night. The exhaustion, the loneliness, and a small, stubborn thread of hope. You taught me that gentleness is its own kind of courage. That what I need isn't a higher wall to keep everyone out. It's a door, to let someone in. He stepped closer, close enough she could see every line in his face. The faint crow's feet at the corners of his eyes, the early gray at his temples. You don't have to answer anything. You don't have to say anything. The house is there. The horse is yours. The rest is up to you. I'm not asking for anything. Cassie felt tears rise, but she didn't let them fall. Not now. She moved closer still, close enough to feel the warmth coming off his body, and she lifted her hand, pressing her palm to his chest, right over his heartbeat. Thank you, she whispered, her voice trembling, for opening that door. Lorenzo looked down at her hand on his chest, then lifted his gaze to her eyes. He raised his own hand, covered hers, and held it there. Warm, steady, like a promise that didn't need words. They stood that way in the quiet office, under the yellow lamplight with night pressed against the window. No kiss, no embrace, but enough, more than enough. The next day, late in the afternoon, sunset poured its bright gold across the Napa Valley. The sky shifted from blue to orange, then to pink, then to purple, like a painting nature had made just for this moment. The hills stretched in the distance, the vineyards lined up in neat rows, the ancient oak trees standing still in the last light of day. Everything was quiet. Everything was so beautiful it felt almost impossible to breathe. Cassie stood beside Shadow in the paddock, her hand stroking the black horse's neck, feeling its warmth under her palm. She'd changed so much since the first day she walked into this estate. She wasn't the invisible woman trying to survive one day at a time anymore. She'd found a place that belonged to her, a roof over her head, and maybe someone she could lean on. Lorenzo stood beside her, silent but present. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Just standing there with her in the golden sunset was enough. Somewhere in the main house, life continued as usual. Rosa was preparing dinner in the kitchen. Maggie was checking tomorrow's schedule. Derek was arranging guard rotations, and the work of an empire still waited for Lorenzo's attention. But here, in this paddock, nothing mattered except this moment. Nothing mattered except the 3 lives standing together in the last sun. Shadow lowered its head to Cassie, the way it had on the first day when she placed the sugar cube on her open palm, the way it had done every day since. A gesture of trust, an admission that she was the one it had chosen, the one it belonged to. Lorenzo looked at the horse, then at the woman standing beside him. The small woman with a 9-month belly, with chestnut brown hair lifting softly in the evening wind, with calm eyes he'd loved from the first moment he saw them, even when he didn't yet know it was love. Then, slowly, deliberately, Lorenzo lowered his head too. Not a bow of surrender, not a bow of the weak before the strong, but a bow of respect. Respect for the woman who'd taught him that real strength didn't live in the walls he'd built, but in the door he'd dared to open. Cassie watched him bow his head, and her heart tightened. She reached out and placed her hand over his. Warm, steady, real. Thank you, she whispered. 2 words. Only 2. But they held an entire universe. Thank you for saving her. Thank you for protecting her. Thank you for giving her a home. And most of all, thank you for seeing her, truly seeing her, when the world had treated her like she didn't exist. Lorenzo didn't speak. He only turned his hand, laced his fingers through hers, and held on tight. They stood that way as the sunset slowly faded, in a world that held only them and the black horse beside them. And in that moment nothing else mattered. Not the empire, not the enemies, not the painful past. Only the present, only them, and that was enough. Because love doesn't always arrive with bright fireworks. Sometimes it comes quietly, like a sugar cube on an open palm, and it changes everything. This is the story of a pregnant woman who gentled not only a wild horse, but also a man who'd forgotten how to trust. This story gives us a deep lesson about life, that real strength doesn't live in cruelty or coldness, but in gentleness and patience. That sometimes, to heal the deepest wounds, we don't need violence or power. We only need a heart that understands and a hand extended in love. Just like Cassie did with Shadow, and with Lorenzo, each of us has the ability to bring peace to frightened souls, if we're patient enough and brave enough to open our hearts. How does this story make you feel? Have you ever met someone hiding fear behind a strong exterior? Do you believe gentleness can change even the coldest hearts? Share your feelings in the comments below. We'd love to hear what's in your heart. If this story touched you, please subscribe to the channel, hit like, and share this video with the people you love. Every subscription, every like, every share is a huge encouragement that helps us keep bringing meaningful stories to you each day. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and daily peace. Thank you for taking the time to listen. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.